Yowzer. So anyway, first thing I want to say, and Ashley pointed this out as well, but I am so grateful to be able to say to you and to myself to remind us how much we are loved, how much we are precious in God's sight, and in God's eyes we actually are perfect. We are perfect. God does not make junk. We have choices to make that can change that, but we are intrinsically perfect, gifted in powerful ways to make a huge difference in our life and the world. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Now, looking at today's lesson, one of the things to keep in mind, this is Matthew is writing to the church around 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. The church is storming and forming throughout the ancient Near East. We do see evidence of some economic justice taking place. Rich and poor come together in communities and share what they have, and that's a very good thing. But on the other hand, there are different voices that have different opinions by a whole lot of different things. And some of those voices line up with what Jesus is teaching, and sometimes they don't. And when they don't, there's conflict. And there can be conflict on either side. And that's a challenge that he's trying to unpack in this new church. And it probably is the same challenge the church has been trying to unpack for over 2,000 years. But in any event, that's what's going on. Now, Jesus says that I come to bring division. And that means that not all people are going to follow me. Not all people are going to follow me equally, or some are just not going to follow me at all. And for us, the question is, at what point does the discernment really become established between what we are taught at home versus what we understand Jesus' teaching to be, let's say, at church? There can be differences, there can be distinctions, and sometimes those differences and distinctions can create conflict, even today. Now, where I was brought up in church, I became aware of this conflict at a pretty early age, maybe 9, 10 years old. I listened to the lessons in the Sunday school, but then when I got out of the Sunday school room, I heard voices in the halls talking in ways that did not sound like Jesus. And that created conflict. What does all this mean? Jesus wants us to live the peace, to follow, to share God's love at all times and in all places. That is the voice we are to follow. And when we do, and those who live with us do, there is a great energy and synergy that takes place that is absolutely miraculous. When people to come together and understand the teachings and want to live them out, it's powerful. God's love flows out of us in ways that are just extraordinary and hard to explain. It's a great thing. It's a great thing. Now, the problem is that the people do not only listen to Jesus. We do not only listen to Jesus. Jesus wants the best for all people, not some people. He's thinking about this equality thing. He's thinking about common good. He wants all of his Father's creation to be lifted up. He wants the strong to help the poor, the rich to help the poor to teach the rich. He wants us all to come together because he knows how gifted we each are. He can count even all the hairs on our head. But there are voices out there in our world, there always have been, from the beginning of time to today. There are voices out there that really are voices of greed, corruption, voices that try to divide us rather than unite us, voices that want to actually control us. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. The question is, who do we listen to? Who are we going to follow? And this creates the context for the conflict Jesus is referring to. Now, some people might say, gosh, father against mother, child against, and all this other stuff. How does that tie back to the fifth commandment? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, or love the parents, honor your parents. How does that work with the fifth commandment? Well, it works perfectly well, really, because the fifth commandment is not saying we have to agree with our parents. It's saying we must honor our parents and love our parents. Okay. Very important. It means to practice the peace with them, but not necessarily always agree. It's important. We're not always going to agree. It means to treat parents with honor and respect at all times and in all places. Now, years ago, I was a surrogate on a U.S. Senate campaign. And that meant I went out and gave speeches to high school assemblies and nursing homes and that type of thing on behalf of the candidate. And I remember one day I was sitting in the office talking to the campaign consultant for this whole thing, and he was talking about how important it was to recruit a lot of young people into the campaign, high school age types of people, because he said if they're recruited and if they do the work, the odds are better than even they'll bring their parents' vote with them. Kids on Fire have a way of influencing their parents, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Now, sometimes parents demonstrate a lack of grace, and it can lead to a breakdown in communication. I have a pastor friend in Roanoke who told me a story 3 or 4 months ago about a family in his congregation, a family of 4. All the adults are grown. 2 of the adults, a man and a woman, they were like late 20s, early 30s. They came to their parents and they confessed to their parents that they were gay. One a lesbian, one a homosexual. And they talked about how painful it had been to carry this, how painful it had been to carry it. And the parents were heartbroken. And they said, well, why didn't you tell us? They said, because we listened to how you talked about LGBTQ. And what were we supposed to do with that? Well, they worked it out, thankfully. They worked it out, and the family has totally knit back together. And it's a good demonstration that he is risen. So, what is it that Jesus brings? What is the source of this conflict? In short, we talk about it every week. Same old refrain. He brings the teachings of peace. And he makes it clear that these teachings should be applied to literally every single thing in life. There is nothing apart from the peace. That's what he teaches. That means school, job, communities, family, friends, strangers, enemies, competitors, politics, economics, everything we do should tie itself right back to the peace. That should be the challenge. That's the voice that Jesus wants us to hear. Now, one of the problems we have is that most people take and leave the peace at their discretion. There are some aspects of the peace that seem relatively easy to follow. And then there are others that feel like I'm going to fall off a cliff if I try to follow Jesus on this one. And then sometimes what happens is people literally actions of the peace in their minds, so they don't even have to reflect on it. Conflict happens in families because of those who believe and those who don't, or those who believe in a modified way. And so I think one of the questions is does Jesus expect an all or none proposition? I think the lesson says all, deeply preferred, but at the same time, we recognize this, and he teaches us that God is a forgiving God. God knows intrinsically that some of these lessons are really hard. And there'll be a lot of voices trying to pull us away from the cross. It's tough. Yet, of course, he is forgiving. And so, how do we practice the peace? Here's an example. So, how do we practice the peace? By being merciful. What does that mean? I talked to a widow of a man that she was married to a little over 60 years a few weeks back. Some of you know who I mean. And she said that Sherman, 60 years of marriage, and she never heard him say a negative word about anybody. Ever. And he faced all kinds of challenges and problems, heartbreaking stuff to be sure, but never did he speak poorly. That's a little bit of mercy and grace for sure in action, and it's powerful, and he impacted a lot of people. How do you practice the peace without being compassionate? You know, I think about Mary Ann Evans, who was the inspiration for Pathways and Compassion, our nursing home visitation ministry to those who have been abandoned. And Mary Ann was abandoned. She lost everything. Nobody came to visit her. Brokenhearted to the nines. And we started to get to know Mary Ann. And one of the things I learned about her, as heartbroken as she was, she had a ministry in that nursing home. She befriended a whole lot of heartbroken people. As long as she was able to move around, she would move from room to room and talk to people. She used to play piano in the Baptist church for years. And sometimes she would go into the rec room and start playing the piano, and people would sing along. But in her brokenness, she made a major impact, to be sure. Here's one. How do you practice peace without fighting for justice? And again, this is the flashing red light. For the last 2,000 years, that's the big banger. That's the hardest one. And the crazy thing about it is, if we break down Scripture, I've said this before, economic justice for the poor is the biggest issue in all of Scripture. Over 3,000 verses. Over 10% of the total contents of Scripture deals with economic justice for the poor. There is no issue that comes remotely close to this in Scripture. Yet, it's not talked about as much as it probably should be. It's tough. Jesus would say to his disciples, and he understood the root of the problem, beware of false prophets. They're out there. They're going to pull you off the side. They're going to pull you off center. They're going to do it. Beware, because they're out there. They have nothing, these false prophets have nothing to gain if you practice the peace. Nothing to gain. Beware. Beware. Mahatma Gandhi once said, Gandhi followed the teachings of Jesus. Wasn't a Christian, but he was very clear about the practical application of the teachings of Jesus. And he said, I really love Jesus. I just have a hard time with Christians. I don't understand. I'm not a Christian, but anyway. It was kind of like, and Olaf said this word the other day, it's kind of like Gandhi was an apprentice. He was demonstrating in real time what it means to follow Jesus. How can you practice faith without being filled with grace? How does that work? When I first started going to Antioch a gabillion years ago, and some of the people know who I'm talking about, I can't remember his last name, George, big, tall. George, everybody knows, it's been a long time. George, big, tall guy, and I'm walking in and the narthex is filled with people, but I see him in the distance, and I watch how he is acting and reacting. He was a big man, but he was smiling, he was gracious to everybody. And I just watched. And for me, he preached a sermon just by watching him. And I said to myself, I want to be like this guy. I didn't know him then, but I got to know him, and he was a pretty good guy, filled with grace. I remember a situation when I worked for University of Detroit, a guy named Charlie who gave $1 million gift to the university in 1984. And Charlie, we had worked on this, him and I, for a couple of years, and finally he makes a decision. And Charlie, once he made the decision, he broke down in tears. He was the most grateful human being on earth that God had moved him in that way. It was wild. But he got so much joy. And for Charlie, $1 million is a lot of money. For Charlie, he gave up, 25% of his total wealth, or whatever that's worth or not. Still got a lot of money, but that was a major, major thing for him. And that's grace in action, eh? How do you practice the peace without practicing forgiveness, right? It's a big one. I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't practiced forgiveness. I would not be here at all. None of you would know who I am. There was a time in my life where I had to do some serious work on forgiving a few people. It was not easy. It took months of prayer. But I'm grateful that God gave me the desire to pray for forgiveness. And that helps me to be here today. In the end, life is complex. There's no question. It's filled with nuance, lots of different contexts and situations. People are brought up differently. They read different things. They hear different things. It's an interesting thing. And we do live in a quantum world, which means a world that is chaotic all around us, the physics of life. And we are all being impacted by micro movements that are taking place. And we don't even fully understand it or know it at the time, but there's a lot of information, there's a lot of stuff going on in the air, and we are being impacted on that. And so, with that understood, understanding our faith, a faith in action, should by necessity always evolve. We should never be stuck in that same place. And if we are, it's the equivalent of burying our head in the sand. We should be able to see changes all the time. Jesus gives us this opportunity, and he warns against not doing it. Moses, there's a lot of stuff about stiff-necked people in Scripture. That's mentioned several times. And how people would take the Torah and squeeze all the life out of it. And a voice. I don't know if that's holy. It sounds like me. Anyway, stiff-necked people. And the whole thing, Jesus is trying to open up these understandings to help people take these next steps that need to be taken. The fact is, we're all sacred in God's eyes. The Creator wants the and the music was really loud in the background. And so the contrast of this music and what was being preached or prayed was pretty fun. Anyway, so the peace is the peace. Just like yes is yes, no is no. Jesus wants it straight, or that's what it is. But if it is altered or modified, it is no longer the peace. It might look like it, it might act like it a little bit, but it really becomes something else. It's a little bit like a restaurant who waters down the ketchup. You put that and you look at it, what in the world is this? It's not the same thing. However, in the end, the peace must win out, no matter how hard it is to be fulfilled. No matter how unpopular we may become with family and friends from time to time. To conquer our fears where necessary. To trust the teachings of Jesus and to commit ourselves best as we can. The good news in all this is that we have the gift of life, the gift of faith, and the power always to choose. It's always been given to us. And so, my friends, may we always choose wisely, with the courage knowing that He is risen. Thanks be to God.